I'm Gideon Resnick, host of What a Day. Today, I'm here with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota. It's really great to talk to you. Super appreciate you being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's just get right into it on a topic that I know you've been working quite a bit on. Rent and mortgage payments have been an enormous issue in this pandemic as government officials are telling us to stay home. And for many, that means losing a paycheck or a job. And so now you're calling to cancel rents and some mortgage payments through the end of the pandemic. When you look at all this, why do you see that as one of the most important things to be focusing on?
Thank you. That's a really good question. As we look at debt piling for so many people, and just the urgency in which the stay-at-home orders came in, I know that there are nearly 40% of Americans who we know don't have emergency funds available to cover any kind of emergency. So we know there are so many people in my home state across the country who are looking at what their lost wages will mean for them, knowing that they're not going to be able to pay their rent, they're not going to be able to put food on the table, they're not going to be able to have the resources that they need. And we know that we're looking at a housing crisis much larger than the 2008 crisis if the federal government doesn't step up and step in to avoid the kind of catastrophe economically that we can see. And so across the country, we're seeing people already striking in regards to their rent. And so we have to get ahead of this and make sure that there is relief in place so that we don't have so many people living with the struggles that would come from this. And so we think it's important for us to cancel out rent, to create a fund so that landlords are able to have that covered for them, because they will lose their rent. And so we're having a fund associated in recovering that. And then we're creating a separate fund for lenders to be able to help support landlords with their mortgages as well, because we recognize, right, that people need to make sure that rent is paid so that they're able to sustain their properties. And so we can't just call out for rent cancellation if we are not looking at the whole situation holistically by also covering the mortgages of the landlords. And I think that when we think about this whole pandemic, we can think about the public health aspect, but we also have to think about the economic aspect of this. And both of them need a holistic plan. And so that's why we wanted to put forth legislation that cohesively deals with the crisis that we're about to see within our housing. April 1st came, so many people weren't able to pay their rent. People were able to pay maybe partial. I know that there are some states like my home state of Minnesota here that has eviction moratorium. And that means come June, July, August, the day those emergency declarations are lifted, so many people across our state and across the country, people who live in states where there is an eviction moratorium, once that's lifted, so many landlords will move ahead and evict those people. And so it is important for us to make sure that this rent cancellation is in place, that the landlords have the support that they need to be able to sustain their properties, and that we have a plan that soothes us in to what recovery will eventually look like for all of us.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point to be thinking beyond, just a quarter at a time or a month at a time. And to that end, there has been some concern, I guess, about the prior relief package and the extent that it actually went to even help folks that are in dire need. Do you see much support growing for the next relief package to go further in terms of being more inclusive of who actually gets emergency assistance, or in tackling the racial disparities that we're seeing when it comes to who is actually contracting this virus?
I mean, you allude, right, to the economic and social injustices that have existed and persisted for so long in this country that we are now really coming to see it lay bare. We're seeing across the country in cities that are hit the most hardest, the people who are completely being devastated by this pandemic are people of color, often Black folks who live in communities where there's a cluster, where there are socioeconomic disparities. We're seeing what's happening in Chicago, in New York, and in Michigan. And so it's important for us when we think about putting a package together that it is a cohesive package that takes care of those that are most vulnerable in our communities, but also works to uplift everyone. What we've noticed in the last package was that, you know, as we fought really hard to protect the lives and the livelihoods of every single person in this country, so many people were left out of that. We're seeing so many loopholes in the package that was proposed. We know so many folks in our community who are undocumented are not included in that package. We know people who make more than 75, essentially who will still have rent and mortgages due that are not going to be able to cover that, were left out. And people who are even making under 75, $1,200 doesn't really cover your rent in most places. It doesn't cover food. It doesn't cover all of the other costs that you have for a family like my own that is, you know, a mother with 3 young children. And so it is really quite devastating when these policies are rushed through and people are not centered in those policies. And so the next package, we're asking for things like a rent cancellation and mortgage relief. We're asking for things like student debt cancellation and a pause on the collection of student debt and for so many other debt that exists for so many of us. We're asking for support, like the expansion of SNAP and the ability. I just introduced a bill that creates mechanism for people to use their SNAP benefits to order food online. We've noticed that, you know, young people who were claimed by their parents as dependents, who are now independently living by themselves, are not covered in the package. We've also noticed that people who live in a mixed status families, where one person might not have residency or citizenship, but the other does, they will not be able to get the relief that was put on in the CARE Act. We also know that there are so many people who really just are going to need additional support. And so our priority really is to make sure that small businesses have the support that they need. I introduced the ABLE Act a little while ago to cover the cost that's that small businesses have, like their paycheck loss, maintenance, you know, rent and all of that, so that they're able to sustain themselves. It doesn't make any sense for us to provide, you know, financial support for individuals when we can actually make sure that there's a payroll protection program that takes care of the wages that people would have normally earned. And that just is a smart policy, because tomorrow when we get out of this pandemic and people are able to freely move around, we want people to have their jobs restored as fast as they can. And so that the economy itself is able to bounce back and sustain itself. And so there's so many tragedies, I will say, in what we're dealing with right now, and what we are doing as individuals in Congress as part of the progressive congressional caucus, and as the whip is trying to build as much consensus around policies that center people, that create an opportunity for our lives and livelihoods to be protected.
And given all of that, are you optimistic that the next package will be different and go further, given what we're discussing and then all this data we've seen on unemployment since the last bill passed, and kind of the sheer velocity of the economic crisis that we're seeing, are members of Congress attuned to that and getting more aggressive in a sense?
Um, Unfortunately, there is still so much talk about the last package. And I think that so many members of Congress are still getting the message out to their constituents about what was included in the last package, and not enough people are really spending a lot of energy in talking about what the needs are going forward. And so I really am aggressively pushing for the recognition that we still need to do more. The problem that we're running into is, as you know, we have control of the House, the Republicans have control of the Senate, and we want any kind of package that we put forth to have the consensus of both parties so that the president can sign it and the American people are able to get the relief that they need. And that in itself is very challenging. And so what we're going to need is for the public to really call their members of Congress to make them understand the urgency in moving a package that is inclusive, a package that really speaks to the needs that people have, and a package that doesn't leave anyone behind. So many cities across the country are being devastated by this pandemic. And the last package that we put forth doesn't cover any of the cities that I represent. And we put out a letter to the Treasury to ask them for clarification and for guidance on what our cities should do. And so I know that as people deal with utility shutoffs, as rent, as small businesses look at the possibility of their businesses collapsing, as so many young people look at their future passing them by, we want to make sure that as leaders, as members of Congress, as the federal government, that we are doing everything that we can in sustaining people at the moment, but also putting forth an agenda that will help bounce our country back.
And there are a lot of priorities that we've discussed in just a short amount of time here, but two other kind of quick ones that are things that people are talking about as well. How does the conversation around the funding of the Postal Service and vote by mail fit into the frame of what you're thinking right now, and how you sort of wedge those things in as well in the kind of context that we're talking about?
I mean, it's quite dangerous and alarming to hear some of the rhetoric around support and funding for our postal offices when it comes to this administration, the president, and the Republicans. Privatizing and creating a for-profit system with our postal office really is quite dangerous for all of us. And as our nation really grapples with the reality, we might not be safe enough to go to the polls come election day, whether it is in our the primaries that are left, or even in our general election. It's important that we recognize how valuable it's going to be to have a federalized, nonpartisan postal system that allows for the mail-in ballots to get into the hands of our citizens, and for that process to be without disturbance, so that people can have assurance in our democracy, can believe in the integrity of our democratic process, and really understand that there is going to be accountability and transparency. We've been sounding the alarm in Congress, and my hope is that leadership understands the importance of putting the funding for our post offices as a priority and as an issue that needs to be addressed before we are able to negotiate any kind of a package. My father used to work at the post office. I myself worked at the post office at one point in my life. And we lack uh, the um, the understanding truly of how valuable that they are, and how hard those people work, day in and day out. And I think it is really paramount that we do everything that we can in providing the resources that they need, and furthermore creating the protections that they need to be able to continue to deliver our mail every single day, without really putting themselves at risk of contracting and spreading this virus.
And you mentioned 2020, and there was some news today before we started talking about, Senator Sanders, who you supported in the primary, endorsing former Vice President Joe Biden. Do you see yourself endorsing Biden, or how are you sort of viewing all of this right now?
So I remember, when Senator Bernie Sanders called me to ask for my endorsement, I really didn't have issues of contention with him. I remember, the senator going through a list of things, and me saying, "Senator, I'm just going to stop you. You have my support. You're the reason I continue to believe what is possible, and I am really excited to support you and make sure that people understand how important it is for people to support you." My district voted for Senator Bernie Sanders, who was one of the only districts in Minnesota to do so. And so I know that to my constituents, it wasn't really about that one person. It was about the policies that the senator put forth, the platform that was inclusive and really spoke to the issues that people were grappling with in their day-to-day lives. And what I have always said as I ran for office is that we want people to represent us who have fluency in our day-to-day struggles. And for so many of us, that was understood when the senator spoke, right? We understood that he had fluency in the issues that kept us up at night. And he spoke to the heart of that issue, and he put forth an agenda that addressed that. Now, when it comes to our nominee, I of course will support, but I also know that it is going to be important for Vice President Biden to really understand that poll after poll, people wanted Medicare for all as a policy platform implemented in this country. There was a society that they envisioned, and that society includes one that is doing everything that it can in fighting the climate crisis that is before us, in fighting for student debt cancellation and freeing 45 million Americans from the shackles of student debt. And so what I am looking for is a gesture from Vice President, that he understands that these are the issues that are important to people. Although they voted for him, every single exit poll said these were the issues that were important to them overwhelmingly. And if people had the opportunity to really vote on those policies, that is what they would choose. And so I think there is an opportunity for him. As I say, every setback is an opportunity for progress. And we look forward to the kind of progress that he provides in the reshaping of his platform, in being inclusive of so many Americans who really want a positive change in their lives.
Yeah, and we know that there were, some concessions, if you will, in the last couple of days from him. It was lowering, Medicare age eligibility from 65 to 60. But as Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was saying in an interview with the New York Times today, that is different than what even Secretary Clinton was proposing in 2016, which was, 55 or 50. So when you look at the situation, what would a meaningful gesture sort of constitute to you and to your constituents that you'd want to be seeing from him?
mean, what we would love to see is, someone who listens, someone who is in tune to the issues that so many people care. I know that there is a conversation oftentimes about, get on board, we have to defeat Trump, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But people didn't vote for Trump without, uh, understanding of what they might get with Trump. If they tell you otherwise, that's not true. And I believe that there is a difference between ushering people along and convincing people. And it's going to be important for people to be convinced that the kind of policies that will be implemented once he's in the White House are going to create a positive impact in our lives. I represent a generation of young people who are shackled with student debt, and many of us are looking for an answer to that crisis. As one of the first two Muslim women who have the privilege of representing Americans in Congress, we currently have a Muslim ban. I don't know if Vice President Biden has said and has promised that he will overturn that ban and will move us towards a more inclusive policy. As an immigrant, as a refugee, someone who's crossed a border and survived because of the generosity of so many people, and had the opportunity to start anew here in the United States with the refugee resettlement program, I need to hear what his plans are when it comes to immigrants at our border, and when it comes to immigrants that are currently sitting in refugee camps across the world. As someone who obviously cares about foreign policy, I really need to hear a cohesive agenda on what his foreign policy is going to be. As you know, I have my Pathway to Peace, the first bold vision of foreign policy agenda ever introduced in the House of Congress. I would love for the opportunity for the Vice President to take a look at that and see, if there are some policies that he is willing to implement in his new administration. We also like to see people who they're going to surround themselves. And I know there are so many people who are eagerly awaiting to see who he picks for a vice presidential candidate, waiting to see, what their background is, what policies have they cared for. I think a huge concession would probably be having a progressive on that ticket, someone that really speaks to the policy issues that we care about. And so, I can go on, but right now, I think some of the concessions that are being made don't go far enough. And I know that there are people who are spending a lot of energy in telling us to shut up and get on board, and not spending a lot of energy in listening and saying, what is it going to take for young people to vote? What is it going to take for immigrants who in every single primary race overwhelmingly voted for Senator Bernie Sanders? What's it going to take for Muslims who for the first time felt empowered, engaged, and cared for, and visible in a presidential election? What is it going to take for them to do the same turnout as they did for the general election? I know we have lots at stake in this election cycle. And it's going to be really important for there to be an honest conversation on what it will take to energize people across this country so that they are overwhelmingly turning out their families and their friends and people who are associated with them in those key states, because Michigan is going to be important. Pennsylvania is going to be important. Florida is going to be important. These are states that have an overwhelming numbers of Muslim and immigrant voters. And most of us are interested in seeing what the policy agenda that speaks to us is when it comes to Vice President Biden.
And to sort of tie the two themes together of the pandemic and the election that's actually coming up, how does the country and our lawmakers sort of move to a position where they understand and work towards correcting the inequities that the pandemic has revealed, right? Because to the point that you're making, a lot of people are sort of itching to defeat Trump and then turn the page in that regard. But the pandemic is certainly revealing crises that existed and exacerbating those crises prior to. So how do you kind of see over the course of the next year the way that somebody can effectively make that point and effectively win on that point?
I mean, what I think this pandemic has shown us clearly is that there is an injustice in our healthcare system. And so I think when you're approaching a conversation during this pandemic, really honing in on what it means for people to have access to healthcare that is not tied to their employment, because there's so many people at this moment who used to be covered, who currently aren't covered because they lost their jobs because of this pandemic. And so I think the reality that in any given day, so many Americans can lose their coverage is a reality today, right? Like we used to talk about that in theory. Mm-hmm. We see that in practice. We also know that premiums are expected to be like 40% higher than they were. And so it's really one of those great magical opportunities that sort of falls on your lap as a candidate to talk about the importance of Medicare for all. And I think anyone who isn't really taking advantage of that opportunity isn't going to speak to the mother who lays awake worried every single night that now that she's lost her coverage, or the ones that didn't have coverage, who have children who have diabetes because they can't afford or access insulin for them. And so I think there is a great opportunity. We've seen so many people who don't even identify as Democrats voting in the primary for Senator Bernie Sanders because that was the defining issue for them. And I think that issue now is just like exploded. And it's one that every single person is talking about and understands why it's important. And I think, living wage is another important issue to talk about and campaign on. There's so many people who are so grateful for our frontline workers, who are so grateful for who we now deem essential workers, who we used to say, right? Like they have unskilled, this is unskilled labor. They're not that important. We can live without them. We realize, long and behold, that these are the people we need the most in our society. And without them, we don't get to eat. Without them, we don't get to transport ourselves from one point to another. And I think for many people who even understand how important they are, don't recognize the fact that many of these people who are working at your grocery store every single day, they themselves are probably going to a food pantry and don't make enough money to feed themselves. Now think about that. So many people who we thank every single day for their sacrifice and service to our country don't make enough money to house themselves, to feed themselves, to care for their children, to have the ability to sleep a peaceful night without worrying about what's to come tomorrow. And I think this is a great opportunity for the Democratic candidate to say, we are going to work in trying to make sure that there is dignified work and that you make a living wage, that you have the opportunity to a home, that you have an opportunity to healthcare, that you have an opportunity to a living wage, that you have an opportunity to send your kids to school that is that has all of the essential services that your child and family will need. We get to understand that now, and we can actually really talk about it on the campaign trail. Broadband is another big issue. So many people who have children are recognizing now that the stay-at-home policy is in place, they can't really help their kids distance learn because they don't have a reliable internet service. So many families can't even afford it, but even the ones that can don't live in a place where that service is reliable. And so championing and fighting for the expansion of our broadband across the country and building a 21st century infrastructure in our country is an issue that in an urban area, in a rural area, everybody connects and everybody understands. I championed that issue on the Education and Labor Committee. My sister from Connecticut, Johanna Hayes, champions that because she is a teacher who's understood the need for kids to have access. And so I think when people around the world look at our country with all of its resources, they can't fathom that there are children in America who have hindrance to their education because they don't have the proper resources that they need, is really, I think, an opportune moment for us to hone in on these issues and fight for them like hell.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, thank you so much again.